The MBR example case study template is to be used for articles where you want to tell an interesting story about an organization or a situation, and you want the story to be the central feature and the analysis and discussion of it somewhat secondary. If you take a look at the template, we expect an article of this type to identify a situation of potential interest to managers. That's going to capture their attention. It has to be written in an engaging narrative. One of the things about the MBR is its target is not specifically researchers, its target is managers, and so as a consequence, it's very important that you write the story in a way that will entertain the reader. It should never normally explain why the outcome of a particular story might not just be exactly what a manager expects. If you're telling a story that's already familiar to everyone, in whatever form it has appeared, then you're not going to really capture their interest. If possible, it would be nice to place the story in the context of existing theory, but if theory provides a major portion of your analysis or your paper, you might think about the research case study template, which puts the theory in front of the actual story. And we would expect it to have implications in terms of broader questions for research or business problems. And like most of the MBR templates, we expect it to be around the 10 to 15 page mark according to the template. Like all the MBR templates, the example case template gives you an idea of what the reviewers would be looking for when they examine your submission. And typically, we would expect them to place a high priority on the significance of the issues being covered in the example case. That's just common sense. The degree to which the outcomes of the story are likely to be either novel or confusing to managers. And the idea of generating confusion is then you've got to explain why it actually makes sense. You can't just leave them confused. The degree to which your analysis or theory offers a convincing explanation for findings. Most of the time, a story by itself will not be sufficiently interesting to engage all managers. And finally, a presentation of the findings in a manner likely to engage readers. That's something that is part of all the MBR templates. As with all the templates, so there's a set of instructions. Save the template under a new name, write your case in the template, use title styles and headings as it specifies, use graphics appropriately, and you have to complete the reviewer appendix at the end of the template. And in the case of the reviewer appendix for the case template, the things that are interesting is, where did the example come from? How reliable is our reporting of the example? The types of things that convince the reviewer that this case was developed in a rigorous way. As is the case for all MBR submissions, there is a one-page cover sheet which doesn't go directly in the article, but which contains some very important information, the title, the tagline, and this tagline basically is going to go on the cover of the journal when it's printed. It's going to go on the website to identify what the submission's about. It will go out over social media, and as a consequence, it's very important to use 25 to 50 words or thereabouts to really capture what is of interest in the case, what the case is about. Think of it as being a little bit like a Twitter feed. It will have keywords. This is going to make it easier for researchers to find your work when they're searching for it. And then an executive summary, and the executive summary will go in the body of the text. And the executive summary is very important because if you have a manager or a practitioner scholar reading this, if the executive summary doesn't grab them, chances are they aren't going to read any further. When you're writing the body of an example case, you will have an introduction, which basically highlights the business problem. You can make this pretty short. You don't want to use the same words as the executive summary or the tagline, but It's just something to give the reader a heads up as to what they're going to be reading. Then the case itself, you don't necessarily have to use the case as a heading. You might use the title of the case or something like that here. And this is going to provide the case narrative in story form. And in the example case study submission, this is the heart of the submission. This is where the meat and potatoes comes. Unlike the research case, where theory plays a much larger role. After you've written the case, then the next thing you need to do is a little bit of discussion, and the discussion should sort of highlight your interpretation of the story. But you don't necessarily have to tie it into research theory, though you're certainly welcome to. But it's basically some sense making that you do, and explain why the case is interesting. And if you need a new conceptual scheme to explain what you've observed, that's fine. But in this type of submission, we want to let the readers draw their own conclusions about the case as well. So we don't want to be too directive in terms of how the reader should interpret what you've written. If you've written a good enough story, they'll have their own ideas. Then you want to have a sort of a standalone conclusions. As with all the MBR submissions, one of the things that we expect is that people will look at the executive summary, they'll jump to the conclusions, and these may be the first two things they do before they decide whether or not to read it. So you want it to be fairly standalone. And if you are going to have any references, which are not required, you want to use APA format for them. The purpose of the reviewer appendix for the example case study and for all the MBR submissions is to convince the reviewer that a systematic and rigorous process was used in creating the case study that is described. And the idea here is that we do not include this in the body of the text because your typical reader won't be that interested, but reviewers are interested because we want all MBR submissions to be grounded in research. You begin by quickly talking a little bit about how you came up with the question of interest which the case addresses. We can then talk about the protocol through which information was gathered for the case. And you can get very specific here because reviewers may be very interested. For example, what data sources you used. Did you do interviews? Did you validate the instrument? All this type of thing, which is of little or no interest to practice, but is of great interest to potential researchers. You should also provide a timeline of how the research was conducted. Maybe talk about differences between the design that you came up with and how it was actually conducted. And the idea is we want to give the reviewers just a clear sense of what went into this example case. Once you are done with that, you can just describe the process through which your discussions and conclusions were developed. This is pretty standard in the template. And ensure that necessary permissions have been acquired. For example, if you're doing a case on a company, you want to make sure that you have gotten permission to report that case because we don't want to have situations where we develop unfavorable relationships with businesses because we published something that they didn't realize was going to be published.